Hi, I'm Kate Childs from FMCG Institute. Here we are again with another roundtable discussion about the challenges facing our industry, particularly as the pandemic settles into new patterns. With me, I have Mark Childs, Chairman of the Institute, and Jim Flannery, the Executive Director, North America. Hi guys, thanks for joining me again.
Thanks, Kate. How's the weather in Barcelona?
It's very hot. We've finally hit summer. What about you?
Really? Well, as you know, I've returned back to Andorra now. We've had very nice weather here, although I think we're seeing the remnants of summer. Within the next couple of weeks, the temperatures are going to start dropping here. Jim, I know you're in Colorado. Are you getting any of the storm from the Gulf, or is that too far away from you?
No, that's too far away. In fact, we could use some of that moisture. We have, it's typically this time of year really hot and dry, so we're kind of high deserty here. And our biggest problem, we've got some fires that are burning, within smoke distance. So right now it's a gorgeous morning, but the last couple of days have been pretty smoky.
Okay, so over to you, Kate.
Well, the first thing I wanted to raise with you guys is that, when the pandemic first started to take hold in, say, March or April this year, a lot of people were at first talking about how it would be over pretty quickly. And certainly by June or July, we'd all be pretty much back at the office and operating as normal. Clearly, that's not happened. And with second waves and in many cases even first waves that have never really subsided, it's been a really big wake-up call to a lot of planners that short-term expectations to return to business as usual were probably pretty unrealistic.
Yeah, I'll just jump in and start. I think that's right. I think when the pandemic first hit, everybody really had high expectations that this was going to be a short-term blip, that there'd be a vaccine quickly come out, and by winter, by the end of the summer, frankly, everything would be back to normal, and that's clearly not happening. One of the things that I'm seeing, though, we've clearly hit a second wave here in the U.S. in a number of different locations. And a number of those locations have the new cases almost back to where the first one was. But there's a much more measured response all around. The panic buying hasn't happened. People are now have processes and systems to deal with this. And I think we're starting to see some lasting trends, right? So you had wave one, everything was chaotic. Wave two, in that more measured response, I think you can see some things that are going to continue. Mark and Kay, we had that call with the group yesterday, and they were talking about their manufacturing plants, and frankly, the sanitation processes in those manufacturing plants, they're changed forever. Some of the folks on the phone were talking about, boy, we should have been doing this all along, right? Not wait until there's a crisis mode like this to put these kind of processes in place. So I think things like that have changed. I think remote meetings like this have changed forever. So there's been a lot of changes.
Yeah, well, and with all our forums internationally, we're hearing virtually nobody's back in the office. I mean, even in New Zealand, most of our clients are headquartered in Auckland, and surprise, surprise, they're back into a second wave, or a ripple at least, but they're back into stage 3 lockdown with limitations on where people can go. So, New Zealand was being lauded as a great example of how to manage this, and there they are back in it. So, we don't hear of anybody who's working back in the office now, and that looks like it's going to be that way for a long time to come. Yeah,
I do agree. And I think when I talk about some of these lasting trends, there's probably some good that's come out of that. Right now, it's going to impact people's livelihood. It's going to impact why I'm glad I'm not in the real estate business for these office type locations. But in some of the conversations that we've had, getting used to doing business virtually, that you were forced to do, and this is going to be a lasting trend because people are saying, I can reach more people, have more productive conversations than I was ever having before. Yesterday we talked to relatively small, I mean, 50 stores or something like that, a Midwest independent family-owned retailer, great stores. One of the folks on the line was talking about, he always hears about the store because his CEO shops in that store. So it's a really high-end store. But it's the kind of size of business where people don't send their sales reps in anymore. And yet virtual meetings, he's had more conversations with more key decision makers because they now can reach out to him in a much better way. So I think some positive.
I think one of the other interesting comments in that conversation yesterday was how a lot of the measures that they've brought into their stores, screens at the checkouts, cleaning and sanitization, they're not going to stop doing that. And I think, to your point earlier, a lot of these changes, they're probably positive changes, just even in terms of flu season in the future, or keep protecting workers, protecting shoppers. And I think a lot of these measures will just stay the normal. People aren't going to take screens out at checkouts now. Right.
And I do think so from the manufacturing side, from the brand owner side, there are a lot of things that'll change in the production environment, in the collaboration. I think in the retail landscape, we're really starting to see long-term trend changes that everybody talked about a new norm, but the new norm a couple months ago really meant I have no idea where this is going. We're just reacting by the seat of our pants. Now you're starting to see some of those trends. So greater investment in e-commerce. A lot of people have said, hey, where we are today is where we expected to be 5 years from now, right? So what's the learning, right? What are people doing and how are they changing their processes to do that? I think masks in environments, they're going to become a norm. Now, actually, the CDC, the Center for Disease Control here in the U.S., just put out some guidance because they're really recommending masks, but they're also there's a tremendous amount of social unrest. And you hear about it, but I saw it for the first time in a store where a woman was in a store refusing to wear a mask, and there were people trying to shop in there, and they were fighting with each other. And so the CDC is starting to put out guidelines about how to handle those kind of situations. Touchless ordering, touchless paying, the self-service checkouts right now. The local store that I was in had one row of self-service checkouts on one end. They put in 2 rows at another end. And when you see where people are going, they're going to the self-service checkout because no one wants to touch stuff. I think those trends are there to stay. I'm not sure about the one-way aisles. There's got to be someone who can learn whether that's worked or not.
Yeah, look, and on your comment about masks, anyone who's traveled in Asia in winter will know that it's just a courtesy in Asian countries to wear a mask if you've got a cold. Yeah. So, forevermore, I think if you cough or sneeze in public in winter, even when this is all over, people are all going to look at you and not really appreciate it very much. So it just becomes a matter of courtesy, of good manners. So I think we've all, to a degree, learned that. I know there's some controversy in the US, but I think in many other countries, it's become a much more accepted practice.
Yeah, and I'll give you my personal point of view, and I think you hit the nail on the head. It's a courtesy for what you can do to other people. I think some of the unrest is you're making me wear a mask, right? And okay, in U.S., I grew up here. This is his freedom of choice. If I'm, if I want to wear a mask, I can. But this courtesy thing, to me, is really important. I was talking to somebody the other day, and to me, again, my opinion, it's like, I live here in Colorado. Okay, I can sit in my house and I can drink my wine. I can do whatever I want and I'm fine. But the minute I go outside and get in a car and drive somewhere where I'm putting others at risk, I'm violating the law. Now that goes beyond a courtesy, but it's the same kind of thing. If I don't want to wear a mask where I'm in a controlled environment, got it. But at least as a courtesy, if I'm going out with other people and I'm not sure whether I've been infected or not, I think that's going to that'll eventually settle in.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm thinking now about some of the more permanent long-term changes in business that we've been talking about recently in the forums, in particular, rethinking decision models and collaboration and when and with who decisions are made within organizations. And I was really interested in our forums in the first place that people felt that less people involved in decisions was great, because it meant you could be very agile and make decisions quickly. But now over time, I think there's more a trend to people seeing that having that cross collaboration and bringing more team members into decision making is something that's maybe been lacking in the beginning, and certainly something that's more valuable as businesses are thinking more medium long term.
Yeah, let me respond to that, Kate. One of the things I'm hearing, and it's good to hear because I've actually been banging away at this for many years, companies will need to become much more clearly focused on outputs and job metrics. No longer is it worthwhile or even feasible to consider showing up as or being involved as a measure of how effective people are. If they're not in the office, you need to know what they're producing. And we're okay with that for the moment because people are pretty much instinctively doing what they always did. But I think they're going to have to get much better at this, particularly as cultures become less clear. The other thing I'm hearing from CEOs is that when you're working from home, the need for support staff starts to become a little bit more questionable because their lives are simpler. They're not doing complex travel, for example. So I think we're going to see the number of support staff, reception, people answering phones, executive assistants, those kinds of people. Those jobs are going to maybe not disappear, but there'll certainly be less of them. The other one I'm hearing from CEOs is that they sit in this big empty office designed for 100 people, and there are 10 people in the office, and they're saying, "Gee, are we using this resource effectively?" I had one of them tell me in Australia recently that he's been approached 3 times now because they own their offices. And there are developers who think that they'd be much better as apartment buildings. And he's saying, maybe they're right. Maybe we don't have a justification for this kind of resource being tied up.
Yeah, I think the business model, again, some of the trends in the learning, it's going to change forever. I do think that people are starting to fray a little bit at the edges by not having that personal contact. I've heard a couple of people mention, boy, the remote thing is really good, but we're learning about some concerns about productivity. Are people really doing it, or you're missing that personal unplanned interaction? Again, what a great time to sit back and say, what have we learned, right? What's working today? Where's the noise? If we're going to continue to work in this environment, what are the best practices that we can begin putting in place and balance it, right? So everybody was forced to go student body left, right? All the physical meetings were canceled. We were forced to do remotely. But to take a step back and say, so what's working, what's not working? The best time in all these changes, the best time to understand what's working and what's not working is while it's going on. It's great to do post-action review. But if you had the time during the chaos to step back and really evaluate, so that as you're continuing to go down the path, you can actually make changes to your processes to see the immediate impact in that environment. I'm not sure enough companies are doing that right now.
Yeah, well, I think that's a great point. I definitely think one of the things that's coming out clearly as a question of how do we handle this is, the question of company culture. One of our participants in a forum said, if this goes on for 2 years, just through a natural attrition rate, you won't know half the team in 2 years. So, the question, how do you build company culture, particularly when you're bringing in new recruits? How do you communicate culture and values? When everything is done through Zoom, it's much more transactional. You certainly don't have any of those water cooler conversations or in the hallway, or opportunities to sort of interact in a social way and feel more, like, I guess, like a family. And then I guess in turn that raises the question of, if we're all working remote and I don't necessarily have the benefits of the company culture, why do I as an employee choose this company to work for or versus this? Does it become just a question of who's going to pay me the most? Because, you know, maybe before there were things like, oh, you can work from home 2 days, we've got this great company culture. But if none of that exists, how do you as a company, as I guess, recruit the best people?
Right. I think there's a general theme, right? So everybody has what they have today. The culture, the office buildings, the brick and mortar, the brands that we built to operate through a store. And now we've got to change. There are a number of companies who have been built around that change, right? So I'm working with a digitally native brand, and I'll tell you what, that company just thinks differently than companies that builds brands to go into a Kroger or a Walmart, and now are trying to take that same process and supply system and work in a digital model. They just think differently. Right? Companies that are built without offices, right? So I'm going to build a company, and it's going to be built around digital interaction, allowing people to work at home. They'll build the culture thing into the process, as opposed to saying, well, no, I build my culture because I have these team meetings every quarter, and everybody gets together and we go out to dinner, and you know, it's just, if you have to dismantle.
Drinks on a Friday, we're going to do drinks on a Friday, but just
right.
I'm sure that works. I think it's going to be a different kind of person and a different kind of interaction. I admire them for trying drinks on Friday through Zoom, but I don't know. It's like trying to do old things a new way, and I think we need to do new things.
That's my point, right? If you have to dismantle what you have in order to move it over here. It's a much more difficult task than saying, well, no, I'm just going to build this.
Yeah, I'm going to change direction just briefly, because I was amused by something you said earlier, Jim. You said I'd hate to be a realtor or a real estate agent, as we call them in Australia. What we've seen a phenomenon in Australia, I'm curious to know if you're seeing it in the US as well, where the peripheries of the major cities are booming, because all these employees are waking up to the fact that if you've only got to be in the office 2 or 3 days a week and you're working at home the rest of the time, you can move out of the city. You can have a bigger house with a garden. You can have your own home office now and commute to the office 2 or 3 days a week. That becomes much more viable. And I'm amused by it because, as you know, I live in Andorra, but I've got a house in the Blue Mountains outside of Sydney that I'm trying to sell. Can I attach an ad to this video here?
Yeah, we'll link it in.
And my realtor who's handling that says his inquiries are booming. And this is 120 kilometres out of Sydney, as you know, Jim, from when you lived in Sydney. And yeah, it's booming. So there are lots of inquiries. And I raised this at one of our forums and in Australia, and one of the GMs said, yes, one of my direct reports is talking about moving to Wollongong, which is, of course, south of Sydney. So this stuff is going to be permanent. People are going to move out of major cities, and they're going to expect to be able to work remotely. Are you seeing that in the US?
Well, so the housing market and the real estate market in the US is booming. Record housing sales or new building permits in the last couple of months. So we're seeing the same thing. I think it's compounded by a lot of the attraction for urbanization, right? I can move into the city. I don't need a car. I can walk to restaurants. I can walk to this and that. There's so much to do. Well, now you can't go into those places, right? So the people, one of the guys on one of our share groups, his son lives in Manhattan. And when he moved there, it was great, right? He's got his 1-bedroom apartment. Everything is right there. Well, now he's stuck in a 1-bedroom apartment.
Yeah. Life, Jim. You're describing my life.
Tell me about that.
Yeah.
I have a fairly tiny apartment, but in the city, and I want to eat out every night and walk around. I don't own a car, but now I'm sort of trapped at home a lot, and I don't know, it's not that great anymore.
Right. My son has a 1-bedroom apartment in Los Angeles. He's in the film industry. That business has been basically production shut down. So he's been living with us here since March. And he bikes and he hikes, and there's just a whole lot more to do when you're not in an urban environment that people. So that they were forced to find something different to do, so they are. So yeah, I think there's some big changes. Hey, before I lose this thought about changes, one point I wanted to make around these new trends. I think companies have learned how to accelerate innovation. Right. So if you go back and people had a great idea, in most large companies, we talked about this once before, large companies versus the startups being more nimble. I think even the large companies have learned how to accelerate innovation. I've seen everything from changes in marketing, TV commercials addressing the pandemic and how their brand can play in that area. You try to make a change to a TV commercial before, it takes you 2.5 years. I've seen new brands come to market. I've seen these SKU rationalization decisions happen like that. I've also seen some interesting new partnerships. So one of the companies that I'm aware of has now partnered with a local retailer, a big retailer, and school districts to create a program to sanitize the schools. That kind of innovation in the past would have taken, a long time with, 8 people that can say no and no one that can say yes. And now the innovation has really sped up.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. There's like the innovation, being able to meet the changed usage and attitudes that we've seen in the pandemic. I think in the beginning, on the supply side, we saw companies really grappling with supply and, dealing with product shortages on shelf, making sure there's enough toilet paper and pasta, then, prioritizing A brands in production, and then, cutting promos in some cases in retailers. But now we're definitely seeing that shift from supply continuity to range strategy. And I think this whole innovation piece is really tied into that.
No, I agree.
So we talked in an earlier video about mass substitution, that because of the shortages, consumers across the world have had an opportunity to, well, not just an opportunity, a necessity to trial competing brands. So we can't assume that they'll be unchanged by that. They really are going to have different, as you said, Kate, usages and attitudes. And we talked to a number of clients who are saying, we've got to adjust to the fact, at least in the short to medium term, the consumers just aren't using our products the way they were before. So it comes down to a pretty dramatic range reset. And manufacturers can't just wait this time for retailers to press them to cut the tail or to rationalize. And quite a number of manufacturers already stepping up and making decisions. I mean, the well-publicized one was Mondelez, of course, deciding and announcing they were cutting 30% of their range. But really, we talked to lots of companies who are making those sorts of decisions. And anyone who isn't is going to be left behind. So in a recent forum with CEOs, I asked them, when we were talking about where will you cut costs? And I said, I didn't really expect to get an affirmative for this, but I asked them, so is market research one of those discretionary areas where you can save money? And they really jumped on me and said, no, we need to be investing more in market research because the market's changed dramatically and we need to understand it better. So I think everybody realizes that they're going to have to innovate pretty dramatically in this new environment.
Yeah, back to my point about you're in the middle of this change and learning instead of doing a post-action review, now's the time to start doing that market research to find out, from the consumer standpoint, right? Everything is ultimately driven by the consumer. What are the things that we're doing? What are the changes that we've made that the consumer is actually really supportive? Boy, I wish you'd done that all along. And then which of those changes are the consumers tolerating? And saying, boy, I can't wait for it to get back along so I know how to do it that way. But, now when consumers are experiencing that, or now when business is experiencing that, this is the time to understand it. Not a year from now when you're doing, looking back. So I think the need to do research, consumer research, business process research, dive into your cost structures. Now's the time to do it, not later. And I do think, to your point, probably the clearest thing is this: what's happened to the out of stock levels, range reviews, substitution that the consumer was forced to take. That's kind of been the perfect storm. That's going to create a lot of changes.
Yeah, well, we've spoken a lot in our forums that there's been really great cooperation and collaboration between trading partners initially, but that a lot of manufacturers feel that there is a reckoning coming.
Yes, I agree on that. We're getting that signal. I mean, really, the reckoning is here in some places because some retailers are behaving quite aggressively now towards manufacturers, talking about range rationalization, as we alluded to earlier. But quite often, and my concern is that range rationalization is quickly going to turn into what we call cliffing. Now, for those who don't know, and I have explained this in other videos, cliffing is an idea or a process that was originally invented by Tesco in the UK, or with the assistance of one of the major consulting firms. And cliffing is the idea of, on a rotational basis, deliberately picking the weakest SKU in a category and pushing it towards the cliff edge, demanding better margin, or over the cliff you go. And you just keep on doing that. You keep picking the weakest one and pushing them over the cliff. And what happens is the one that's over the cliff, some of them eventually come back with a plan to give you a better margin. And so progressively the retailer gains better margin overall in the category. Now, I think that's a fairly cynical approach to range rationalization, and I hope it doesn't turn into that. But we're already seeing some signs from some retailers that they're going to be squeezing manufacturers coming to them to pick up the bill for all the costs that they've incurred during the pandemic. And most of them have achieved growth in their top line. Some of them are saying that that's been virtually wiped out by their increased operational costs.
Yeah, so a couple points come to mind there. Let me talk the range rationalization. Then I do want to come back to the earnings and sales results of the industry and kind of this back and forth that I'm seeing. I think what this perfect storm created is everybody, both ends of the supply chain, really coming to grips on the importance of range rationalization, right? Number one, because you couldn't get it. Number two, and I've seen it happen in spades with retailers, private brands, as much as with branded goods. The surge in demand was so great that the only way to compensate for it was stop producing the tail. So you can produce those 20% of SKUs that 80% of consumers purchase. So I think this is coming to question, an idea of cliffing, which is really, I make higher margin, but I actually wind up extending the tail. I just don't know that's sustainable. Now, to me, the question is focusing on those fewer smaller varieties. Is that something the consumer is tolerating, or is that something the consumer is satisfied with? And I think we'll see where that goes over time. I also think that smart manufacturers and retailers are going to find a way to do both. right?
Jim, just to clarify, I see cliffing as a trading action. And, you know, old style retailers who think
Yeah.
they make their money by negotiating with suppliers. What you're talking about in better range to meet the needs of shoppers, that's marketing. And some retailers are good at it, but some aren't.
But even in the cliffing, I understand that's a short-term tactic to increase margin. But that the output of that is you increase margin on something that's a marginal item to begin with, right? So you get that margin, you get that short-term hit. And then what you're going to do is you're going to get rid of that one and start pressuring somebody else to do the same thing. So as a retailer, your energy is focused on the tail, right? Where you can cliff, it's focused on tail as opposed to focus on the major items. So I think people are going to find different ways to do that. You know, now back to the who's going to share what part of the profit in the value chain pie. You know, I do think there's a wave of that coming back, and what we've seen here in the U.S. and you know, it may be different around the world because different countries put different things in place. But not too long ago, after all the manufacturing community were producing their results on Wall Street with record sales, record profits, the retailer community in a fairly organized way came back and said, look, guys, you are seeing all the benefits of this consumers eating at home, staying at home, you're seeing all those benefits, but we've got all the costs. We've got to do these things with our employees. We've got to put the plexiglass shields up. We've got to do all the sanitation. We need to start having a conversation about sharing in your excess profits. So that was a very real conversation. Well, then in the last couple of months, the retailers have begun producing their reports, and they're seeing record sales and record earnings, right? So Target, Walmart, Ahold, Safeway, Albertsons here in the U.S. Now, Ahold and Walmart reported on a global basis, so the U.S. is a part of the mix, but they're all reporting the same impact, right? Consumers are eating more at home, they're doing more at home, so their sales are up and their earnings were up. And as one of the retailers we talked to yesterday, the noise on this, you know, let's divide up the pie, kind of went put on the back burner in the short term because volume covers all sins. That will eventually balance out, right? It's clearly going to balance out a year from now when people are reporting their sales and earnings versus this as the base. But I do think that reckoning is going to come.
Yeah, I think, well, the reckoning will come when retailers and manufacturers have to cycle this year in the middle of a recession, a deep recession. So next year won't be, this year's great. And, you know, bonuses are looking good. You better put them in the bank, fellas, because there won't be any next.
Let me put a maybe more positive angle on this. There is also the opportunity that there could be greater collaboration and an opportunity to work with between retailers and manufacturers now. I mean, they're able to speak much more frequently on Zoom and stay in touch, and they've already seen a lot of benefit from having that sort of constant contact. So isn't it true that this could be an opportunity for manufacturers, if they're on strategy with retailers, to really have an opportunity to collaborate and do better as a team? Or am I seeing this too rosy-colored glasses?
No, I think you're right, Kate, and I think you've corrected us because, you know, we can. The old warriors, with all their wounds, probably look at the world a little bit more negatively because of all the battles we've had in the past. But you're quite right, and smart retailers, and of course you know that we've proven in our research that well-differentiated retailers that are good at collaborating have better metrics than the traders. So you're quite right. Smart retailers are going to take the opportunity, and smart manufacturers are going to engage effectively, focused on this new environment and the new needs of shoppers.
You know, periodically, and I'll date myself with how long I've been in the industry, right? But periodically there are catalysts that light a fire under this whole collaboration space, right? So going way back to the 80s, when mass merchandisers, frankly, in the US where it started, were coming on board, the supercenters were coming on board and they were selling products cheaper. A lot of the retailers would say, oh, you must be selling them at lower cost because they're selling it so cheap. And that lit up the efficient consumer response place. And the answer was no, it's not that they're getting it at lower costs, it's the cost to serve their business model is lower. So how can we take costs out of the system? You know, Mark, a couple of years ago when you and I were deeply involved in the new ways of working together, which started with, focus on the consumer and then share the supply chain, right? There was a catalyst there about, globalization of retailers and how do we take practices from over here and move them over here and which of those practices. So we have another catalyst right now, right? And yes, costs have changed. Yes, costs have gone up. But since the processes have changed, now is, I think, the time for retailers and manufacturers to come together and say, so what are those processes that we've, on an emergency basis, put in place that have raised costs? Now, how can we deliver that same consumer output but get those costs out of the system? And there's a wide open platform for that. I know we want to talk e-commerce here in a second, but I also think that's to me, that's the most immediate low-hanging fruit, because in general, people say, boy, this e-commerce is great. It's 3x, 10x, 97% greater than it's ever been. But I'm making lower margin on that. So that's contributing to my lower results over time. So you need to give me greater margin for that environment. Business today has not been built for e-commerce. Typically, it's a bricks and mortar business that's being translated to e-commerce. There's also a range of e-commerce, right? Direct to consumer, pure play, omni-channel, pick and select in the store. All those have different cost elements. Now's the time for retailers and manufacturers to collaborate and say, got it, we need to take the costs out of the system as opposed to just saying, I want to take your margin and move it to mine.
Yeah, agreed. Look, there's one point I don't want to lose before we go on to talking about e-commerce. We, over the last couple of years, the FMCG Institute have been running a masterclass series called Rethinking Trading Strategies. I'm pleased to say we're probably a little bit ahead of the curve, because if there ever was a time to jettison old thinking about how you're engaging and how you're trading, this is it. And companies really need to think about their commercial planning model and invent some new ways to engage constructively and beyond strategy with retailers. So that'll be my final word on that. I know, Kate, you're keen to get on to talking about e-commerce.
Yeah, well, I mean, as Jim just touched on, e-commerce has jumped ahead, some say, by 5 years. And it's really reshaping our industry. So I did want to talk about that aspect. And so, I don't know, maybe one of you guys want to start off on that.
Jim?
Yeah, so I just give you my thoughts. So my starting point is most of the brands and the retailers that we talk to have a supply chain and a business model built around bricks and mortar. And they're trying to figure out a way how to adjust that for an e-commerce world. There are few, but a number of brands and retailers who have started digitally native, and their business models are just totally different. I do think, to me, it starts with the retailer and eventually gets to the manufacturer. The retailers need to sort out what they mean by e-commerce. I love the ability to get online, choose my stuff, have it go to my local city market here in Colorado, which is a Kroger subsidiary, and Instacart then picks my stuff and delivers it to the store. So that's called e-commerce. I don't really think that's e-commerce. It's moving the order pattern a little, but it's still just got incremental cost to that process. On the other end, where you can create packaging, distribution systems, communication systems around digitally native approaches, I think there's all kind of ways to take costs out of the system. From a pure play e-commerce, I don't care if it's a manufactured direct to consumer or an Amazon or frankly Walmart.com. If when they've got their supply chain built for that, number one, when the consumer is ordering, you don't have the package in your hand, right? So instead of spending all that time and energy on the packaging, the important part is the kind of content that you're delivering, so that the consumer can get that stuff when they're in that e-commerce environment. Mark, remember you were talking the other day about we took a look at the way brands are talking to their consumers on their website, and it's powerful. And then you look at the way e-commerce retailers are talking to consumers about that same brand, and it's like, look, right? So how do you change that first moment of truth, right? Where it's not the package in the hand, you do that from a content basis. And I do think companies need to learn how they take their best communication methods and then run that through this e-commerce model. And then the second thing that I'm seeing is packaging, right? In order to have a product go through the distribution center and get on the shelf, there's all kind of packaging that goes in there. I've been working with one client that has these little bottles of stuff, and the bottle goes in a cardboard container. The cardboard container is put in little cardboard containers of groups of 3, and those groups, because that's the right amount to go to the store. Then those groups of 3 go in a box of 24 because that's what the warehouse needs to ship it out. A digitally native brand would never build it that way, right? They would build that box of 24 without all that excess packaging in there. They would make sure the bottle is strong enough to manage itself through the supply chain. And then they would ship that in the distribution center. So I think, again, now's the time to begin examining the business processes around digital purchases and determine whether the supply system is right. I mean, Instacart is a great invention that's going to be out there. I don't know how to get those costs out, because you're taking everything from a bricks and mortar and then you're adding picking on top of it. But if there were other models that dealt with true e-commerce, I think you can take margins up a lot.
Yeah, I'm hearing clients saying, because notwithstanding what you're saying about, yes, they should develop new models, there are certainly retailers right now, I could mention some, Morrisons in the UK, for example, who are saying to their suppliers, hey, I'm getting poorer margins on what I'm selling through e-commerce, and I'm selling more of it. So I need you to kick the can. I need you to contribute to that. And then I hear manufacturers on the other side saying, hang on a minute, it's your business model. Go fix your business model. Don't make it my problem. You've made money for decades being a consolidator very successfully with a bricks and mortar model. Now you show up at e-commerce with a stone axe. That shouldn't be my problem. My job is to make brands that consumers want. Your job is to find a way to get it to the consumer. So fix it.
But I also think, fix it. But I also think that there are some things that the brands can do to help fix it that actually benefit the brand, right? So, and I use packaging. So if it takes an understanding of the e-commerce model that the retailer has, it goes back to new ways of working together in ECR. Lay it all out. What is the supply chain? Where are the costs in there? So here's the supply chain that sends product to your bricks and mortar store. We know all those costs, right? Here's the supply chain that goes to your e-commerce model. Where are the costs different, and are there things that we can do? In the experience that I talk with, if you go to these bottles to boxes to 3-packs to 24 packs, if you were just to be able to ship the 24 packs, I could probably get 4% out of my costs, and I'm willing to share 2% with you. I do think this is where the new collaboration model, or the collaboration model we've talked for years, has to come to play.
Yeah, agreed. And perhaps I'm a bit too emphatic on my putting the weight on retailers, but the reality is that they have been the consolidators of choice for the last 30 years or more.
Right. And if they've got a bad business model, then they're going to have to fix it. So in the call the other day, what I came out of, the work that Kroger in the U.S. has done with Ocado, where they're a totally automated warehouse that had these phenomenal picking rates that get the products to the consumer at yes, you have the shipping costs, got it, but you don't have the bricks and mortar costs, you don't have the store costs, you don't have those employee costs, you don't have, all the extra costs put in for sanitation and safety. You don't have all those costs. Versus somebody whose e-commerce model is an Instacart where it's just incremental costs. So the retailers have to choose, but I do think the manufacturer community needs to go into that with that same kind of thing. Okay, let's take it. I'm not just going to take my margin and give it to you. I mean, take the pie and just fight over who gets what piece. That always winds up as a disaster. But how do you grow that margin pie? By taking costs out.
Yeah. Yep. I get it. Look, we've probably run out of time now. So I guess it's over to you, Kate.
Well, I mean, I think it's been an interesting discussion, and great to have you guys both on with us together today to talk about this. And I guess we'll look forward to the next one.
Yeah, Jim, watch out for that moose that wanted to stick.
I'm gonna fix that as my screensaver next time I do it. I had to move my camera because we've been doing we're having carpet put in. I had the camera on the thing over here, but all the furniture from the top 2 floors of our house right now are stacked up in the corner here.
I have to say, you've got a less impressive background this time. I was enjoying your fireplace, your grand library. Background. Now that you're in Andorra, I feel like maybe there should be some snow-capped mountains behind you. Could you not oblige us with that?
Yeah.
I can tell you, I can look out my window right here at snow-capped mountains when it's snowing. So maybe I'll try and organize that for when the weather.
Yeah, there you go.
Anyway, so good to talk to you both. Stay safe with those fires, Jim.
Take care, everybody.
Bye, Kate.
Bye-bye.